And welcome in. Happy Dubas Day, everybody. It is Fifth Avenue Faceoff. I'm Chris Mack. We're recording this, about 20 minutes after Kyle Dubas got done introducing himself to the Pittsburgh media. Not in Pittsburgh, but very much a part of the Pittsburgh hockey media. Dan Kingerski, who joins me live with a humble flex there as you see him in beautiful sunny Las Vegas. If you're watching the show on YouTube, go to the 93.7 The Fan channel and subscribe there. You'll get new episodes of Fifth Avenue Face-Off on YouTube as soon as they are available. You prefer the audio-only version? I don't understand why, with that beautiful view from Dan's hotel room and of this face right here. Why would you prefer the audio-only? Go to your Odyssey app, AUDACY. Just tap the little follow button up there in the upper right-hand corner, and you'll get notified of new episodes as soon as they are ready, just like you were notified of this one on Thursday afternoon. As soon as we got done with it, you said, hey, how did this all happen? Why did it take so long? And where do we go from here now that Kyle Dubas, Wonder Kid, is in charge of not just the general manager position for the Pittsburgh Penguins, but hockey ops, director of hockey operations, which means there's a lot to do in the next few days and weeks for him, including hiring a new GM, getting ready for the draft and free agency. And Dan, before we look forward, you guys did great reporting on this throughout the whole process at Pittsburgh Hockey Now. So I'll ask you. How did this go down? Why did it take so long? And I guess unravel a layer or two of the onion that got Kyle Dubas from interviewing for a general manager position, at least that's what we thought it was, to accepting the role of director of hockey ops for the Pittsburgh Penguins today.
Well, boy, that could take up the entire 20 minutes or half an hour, couldn't it? It took so long, and I don't want to be too critical of the Fenway group, but I don't think Pittsburgh fans or people know who Tom Kennedy is. And that's the president of the Boston Red Sox. He was kind of brought into the process. And I think we were the only ones to report that earlier this week, that, he was kind of maybe one of the pieces of the puzzle that no one knew existed. And, a source tipped us off to that. So, really, FSG was using a giant network of people inside and outside of hockey. They didn't start at square one, Chris. They had to actually ask directions to get to square one. They were asking people they interviewed for positions outside hockey, hey, what do you think we should be looking for? Who do you think we should talk to for, Pittsburgh general manager or president? They really were asking everybody on where to go. The NHL was offering advice on the president of hockey operations. And, the process probably took a solid 4 to 5 weeks. And in that process, they kind of whittled it down. We knew the finalists, right? Steve Greeley, right. Matthew Darsh, Jason Botterill. Who am I forgetting? I know Dan McKinnon of New Jersey was also in there. I feel like I'm missing somebody, but
I think you've got the major players, a lot of them with ties to the Penguins organization at some point in their past, too.
Yeah. And then Kyle Dubas kind of becomes available. Mm-hmm. So we learned from the press conference that FSG didn't wait very long. They asked Toronto literally either that afternoon or the next morning if they could talk to Dubas. They make the phone call a day after the guy gets fired, which would have been, I'm not sure if that's Friday or Saturday morning. And the process starts. It kind of sounds like a complete family decision on Dubas's part. The interview, talks with Crosby, Mike Sullivan multiple times, his wife, as with a full family, a couple of kids, his wife's like, well, we have to move.
Yep. If we're going to do it, let's do it now while the kids are young. Exactly.
Exactly. And so I think it makes great sense for Dubas, to put down some roots here. It's a good city for a family, and that's kind of how we got here.
So what's interesting to me is that you mentioned Sam Kennedy, and Sam Kennedy, like you mentioned, is actually president of the Red Sox. Okay, so this is Fenway now reaching out, not in as many different directions as they can find. It's like water trying to find its way to the Gulf of Mexico, and you get the Mississippi River Delta, right? Like, we're just going to spread out as far and wide as we can.
Great analogy, by the way.
Thank you. I've practiced my analogies over the last few weeks. I've had a little extra time on my hands. So as the Mississippi River Delta is created, they find that the one path to the Gulf that makes the most sense is, well, Sam Kennedy. And he reaches out to Kyle Dubas. The reason I bring this up is because what's striking to me is that when you bring up the analytics background that does exist for Kyle Dubas, how he at least embraces them, right? He's not going to hold them at arm's length, much like Ron Hextall did. That this very much smells to me like Fenway wanted to find their Theo Epstein of hockey. And that's what this is. You know, you think of Theo Epstein coming in young to the role that he came into with the Red Sox, being looked at as cutting edge, even though he wasn't necessarily cutting edge. He was just embracing the information that was available to him, and then really building something that was able to sustain itself once he moved on and once he moved upward. This is bringing in Kyle Dubas. This isn't just, hey, let's find somebody to handle the draft and free agency for us for the next few years. This is the guy that's going to lay the organizational framework for the next decade.
I agree with all of that. And it's interesting to note, early in the process, John Henry, of course, a famed FSG owner, consulted, or at least that's the scuttlebutt around the offices there in Boston, was that, one of the first people he talked to was, in fact, Theo Epstein, who's now a Major League Baseball consultant. We were actually told that maybe he was a candidate. And we're like, wait a second.
Wait.
Yeah. We're guessing he just talked to him, kind of for some structure and framework. But you're exactly correct. This is a foundational, a transformational hire by FSG. I mean, it took 6 weeks. I think they got it right. I think they got the right type of person. There will be mistakes, especially here in this next couple or a few years. It's very rocky terrain. They're going to try to pull off something really no one else has, and that is a smooth transition from a Stanley Cup winning and caliber core to the next chapter. I mean, the LA Kings maybe did it the best recently, and they still missed the playoffs, I think, in 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
But now they're kind of back and on the right track. It's, Chicago, 6 years of real suckitude, and the Ottawa Senators have been, missing the playoffs for 6-7 years now as well. And Detroit, it's a decade.
Let me stop you at Ottawa. Because that was something we heard Elliot Friedman mention over the weekend, right? The idea of the Ottawa Senators, because there's new ownership going to come in, that maybe the idea of bringing in Kyle Dubas and letting him run the hockey operations there was something that they would consider. And maybe that was something that Dubas was actually interested in. There was the thought that maybe Dubas just isn't as interested in the Penguins' job as maybe we all assume people should be, right? Because the Penguins' job, at least in some people's eyes, I've heard this from people around the league, they look at it and say, well, they're asking whoever this person is to serve two masters, right? You've got to compete for a cup now, but you've also got to build for the future, like you talked about. Try and smooth out that transition from the big three to the next generation and not skip a beat doing it somehow. And maybe that's not an attractive position for someone because they saw what it just did to Ron Hextall when he wanted to come in and presumably tear things down, and they wouldn't let him do it. So I think there were the two thoughts of, hey, maybe Dubas isn't as interested as we think he should be. Maybe Dubas is positioning himself to get a better deal somewhere else where the farm system's already stocked up and the prospect pool has been put in place, like Ottawa. Or maybe Dubas is just negotiating for more from the Penguins. That third line of thinking starts to gain some credence when you see a guy become the director of hockey ops and not just the general manager. Is that your sense that maybe the last couple of weeks were part of negotiating for Dubas and saying, hey, I don't just want to be GM. I want to oversee the whole damn thing because I want the show to be mine.
I don't put a cynical tone on it, though. I know some in Canada have kind of, put that in a negative light, that maybe he was, posturing or negotiating. I don't see it necessarily in the same vein, although I think that was the end result. I think this was a guy who was rocked by the loss to the Florida Panthers. I think this was a guy who was maybe rattled a little bit by the end of his tenure in Toronto. I think he did want more power. Toronto has a very layered ownership and management structure. It's bureaucratic, to say the least. And I don't think it's a bad thing to say, hey, I know what I'm doing. I know where a team has to get to. I know what this position needs to entail, and I want these sorts of powers. However you want to view that, whether it's kind of in that negative, like some in Toronto did, I kind of view it in a very genuine sort of way. Like, get out of my way. I got this. Here's what I want. So, in that framework or ballpark, I think you're right.
It's interesting to me that everybody got what they wanted in this case, right? Like the Penguins got their man, and Dubas got the position he wanted out from under. Maybe look, they say everything happens for a reason, right? And so maybe in Dubas's case, leaving Toronto, getting this opportunity in Pittsburgh happened for a reason, gets him out from underneath the Brendan Shanahan thumb. But now he's in place, and he talked several times Thursday afternoon about how quickly they're going to have to ramp things up. He's going to serve as interim general manager as well while they press in the direction of searching for a new one, but that may not happen for another few weeks, maybe even might not even happen by the time free agency starts. You'd like to have that in place.
It won't, actually. Dubas is the interim GM until probably mid-July or August, because, he's not going to get permission to talk to people this close to the draft and free agency. At this point, organizations will be like, tough luck. Willing to get rid of somebody.
So with that being said, how does that, I guess, affect the GM position once they do come around to hiring for it? He mentioned he wants someone progressive. I would imagine we end up with someone much like Kyle Dubas, who's young, a little more analytically driven. Is that what we get in a GM position? Is it more, does this open the window back up to the analytic types, the Sam Venturas of the world?
Interesting. We will get kind of a mirror of Kyle Dubas. You're not going to see a Mark Bergevin type jump into the GM role, right? But I guess we'll be publishing this. I'm speaking to you before we publish on Pittsburgh Hockey Now. One of the names out of the running is Jason Botterill. I would presume, at least for the next 6 weeks or so, Steve Greeley and Matthew Darsh are also out. Although you could see a couple of those guys reemerge when Dubas gets to conduct his own search. Because my sense in his answer was he's going to start this from scratch, or at least do it his own way, or conduct his own interviews and his own search. So, I think you'll see some. I think Sam might be a little too analytics, right? He hasn't had to make hockey decisions just yet. So that would be maybe a big jump for a guy like Sam, although I think his work in the hockey community certainly is revered as cutting edge. You can see someone new.
Yeah, and I think the line of thinking there would be, well, I'm overseeing the entire hockey operation, but I've also got the network of contacts needed to pick up a phone and make a call on July 1st or on deadline day or whatever it may be. I'll make the ultimate hockey decisions, but I want my GM to be the person who's steering that conversation toward me with what they've built, which may very well be very analytically driven. All of that aside, once the GM is in place, they're going to get through the draft. They're going to get through the beginnings of free agency, at least with Kyle Dubas steering things. And it'll be interesting to see what direction they go, because I imagine a lot of what Mike Sullivan was pleased with and displeased with is going to steer things over the course of the next 4 to 5 weeks. Quote, Sully can coach forever. He's got no interest, Kyle Dubas, in sending Mike Sullivan, and certainly no interest in sending Sidney Crosby on their respective ways. Those two guys were part of the reason he expressed that he ends up taking the job here in Pittsburgh. So how big of a role is Mike Sullivan going to have over the next 4 to 5 weeks? He's had a huge role, and I would imagine evaluating personnel for the draft especially, and perhaps even possible free agents with the scouting department over the last 4 to 6 weeks. So how do the next the next 4 to 6 weeks get handled?
Well, we've seen the Penguins already sign Alex Nylander to a contract, and presumably that came from Mike Sullivan because there was no GM in place, and they gave an NHL contract. So, somebody had to be like, hey, these decisions need to be made. We learned from the AHL meetings a few weeks ago, a colleague of ours, Tony Andrikaitis, who covers Wilkes-Barre and the Lehigh Valley Lehigh Valley Flyers team pretty heavily, that, the AHL people were talking about Mike Sullivan really pushing FSG to invest resources and rebuild what's become of the baby Penguins, because they really have fallen on hard times for the last few years. The team has been at best terrible. So Sullivan, is, I guess maybe I'd make the analogy, at least for the next 6 weeks, you're going to see a working relationship very close to what I imagine Mike Tomlin and Kevin Colbert having, where someone gives the GM a grocery list and the GM goes shopping. And I kind of see that playing out, at least in the short term.
Sid was a very big part of this as well. That doesn't surprise anyone, I don't think, that Kyle Dubas was very emphatic. One of the first things he said was that, obviously Sid is still at the core of this thing. Do you get the sense that that's part of what sold Dubas on this, I guess, is, nobody sees Sidney Crosby as this ebullient, outgoing personality who's going to, pal around with people, but he's such a thinker, I presume, that I imagine he was able to sit down and let's be honest, he's not far off in age from Kyle Dubas either. They were probably able to sit down and really talk about their shared vision for where this organization and this franchise goes. And so how many of these decisions over the next 4 to 6 weeks and beyond are going to be driven by Sidney Crosby, to be honest?
What was that word? Ebullient?
Ebullient.
Oh, ebullient. I was like, wow, that's I need to look that up.
Cheerful and full of energy. Ebullient.
Yes.
Yeah.
That word I'm familiar with. Yeah.
You're a wordsmith. You're familiar with all the words, Dan. But
no one's ever called me that, but okay.
You get the sense that Sidney Crosby, as much as Mike Sullivan, as much as Kyle Dubas, are going to drive these big decisions, at least over the course of the next few weeks and months.
I think anybody who would discount Sidney Crosby's opinion on anything hockey would do so at their own peril, right? You're right. He is a thinker. I've always thought that he could be a solid GM, very much like a Steve Yzerman, if he so chose to continue his hockey life. Obviously, those great players don't make very good coaches because they think and do things that others can't. But, yeah, I mean, that would be my second conversation too. Talk to Sullivan, talk to Sidney Crosby. And, if Wayne Gretzky told you what his team needed, you sure as hell would listen. If Mario Lemieux pulled you aside and said, I want a winger, I want a defenseman, you'd listen. And Sidney Crosby has earned that status as well.
So to that end, then, I thought it was interesting when we start to spin forward and talk about what the targets will be. We'll get to goaltending in a second because that sounds like it's going to be Dubas's first priority over the next 2 to 3 days. But he talked about the top 6. But it was interesting to me that despite saying the top 6 is very, very good, I mean, you've got the pieces in place there, right? Crosby, Malkin, Gensel, Raquel, Rust, and then from there. He did mention the word supplement, and he did mention the salary cap position that they are in, which he called an advantageous one, I believe. They've got about $20 million in cap space, but some things to figure out in that regard as well. So it's not really probably a true $20 million. Do you suspect that when he sits down and asks Sidney Crosby, hey, Sid, what do you think we need for the top 6, if anything? Is Sidney Crosby going to say, hey, go out and get X, Y, Z? Or is Sidney Crosby going to say, just give me my guys on my wings who I trust and fill out the bottom 6 so that the 12 minutes of forward ice time that we need to get out of guys in that bottom 6 is not being eaten up by guys who can't handle it?
I don't know what Sid would say. I think a bit of that would be driven by loyalty to Jake Gensel and Brian Rust, in which a GM would have to maybe factor that sort of loyalty in. There was one little line that struck me, and I'm probably parsing words. Maybe my old Toronto media day is coming coming back to haunt me. When he said about the prospects we're going to acquire, I sat up a little bit for a moment when he's like, oh, when he said, I'm like, oh, they're going to acquire some prospects. Let's see what he does there, because I think the Penguins have a surplus of top six talent that probably could be moved, let's say, and some prospects, some draft picks brought in, some speed added to the lineup. I don't know if Sid would say this or that for the top six or this or that for the bottom six. I think the obvious thing is that they obviously need depth, speed through that bottom six.
Sure.
You can get by with an identity. And the Penguins don't have any identity in their lineup as a whole, but especially that bottom six. It's just, it was meatball surgery for Mike Sullivan. Yeah.
And I just wonder, we kind of latched on to opposite ends of this as we parse words from Kyle Dubas on Thursday afternoon. You make a great point about acquiring young prospects. I hear him talk about supplementing the top six. And this again brings us full circle back to which way are you going to go, Kyle? Are you really all in on now, or how much of an eye can you cast to the future if you are all in on now? He also talked about, obviously, the bottom six. We all know that's going to be a work in progress that I don't think gets done in one season. I think it's next to impossible to remake that entire bottom six in one season. You've got guys like Paling and Nylander, who you mentioned, and O'Connor, who you can bring back and kind of form the pillars of the bottom six, maybe. But I don't know if you can remake the entire depth forward portion of your lineup in one off season. And then he mentioned the young defense and finding out what they're all about. That tells me in particular, POJ, Ty Smith. Are you guys that can actually contribute every single night as fourth, fifth defenseman? Because what are we keeping a Jan Ruda around for? What are we keeping a Jeff Petrie around for if we can do better things, especially in Petrie's case, with that cap hit? So that tells me that if you can get younger while also getting better, maybe that's the if you're looking for one pathway rather than, again, trying to funnel into a million different directions. If you're Kyle Dubas, the pathway is let's get younger and better, if that's possible.
Yeah. There are some very tough decisions, especially when you look at the blue line because of Petrie, of Ruda. Where do you see POJ in a few years? I happen to think as he gets older, he's going to get more confident. I think, I've often compared PO to Zach Aston Reese in the sense that their biggest holdup was themselves.
Yeah.
And not seizing the full potential within themselves because they viewed themselves in one way or didn't view themselves as potentially, I don't want to use the word great, but they didn't embrace their fullest potential. And I view Joseph kind of in that same vein where he's got the talent to be a top four defenseman every single night. We've seen him take the puck and just fly past people and create offense, and then even go to the net and with whatever, his 180-pound frame can dish out, do some battling. And I'd love to see him really embrace that sort of stuff. I'm not very bullish on Ty Smith. I don't think he has the speed. And I wonder if the defensive zone will just forever kind of dog him. So, yeah, you start to look at that. And look, I'm covering the Vegas Golden Knights here simultaneously. It's why I'm in Vegas. It's not exactly a vacation. And I'm watching what they're doing with their defense, Chris. And I think it's interesting to note, they said screw it in terms of finding speed and high-end, offensive defensemen. Every single guy they've got on their blue line is at least 6'1", 200 pounds. Mm-hmm. 5 of the 6 are like 6'2" and 3, 215, 220. you don't get near the Vegas Golden Knights net. And they've combined that with a heavy forecheck game that Mike Sullivan would love. So I think there's some lessons to learn around the league with that as well.
Yeah. Can you be fast and heavy at the same time? It's
you have that duality. And look, I mean, they might have the Stanley Cup coming down Vegas Boulevard in a couple of weeks because they figured it out.
Let me ask you this then. Despite anything else Kyle Dubas does this offseason, like I mentioned a moment ago, and as he mentioned, the first thing they've got to figure out is goaltending. He says he wants to get to know Tristan Jarry a little bit, wants to talk to Mike Sullivan and Andy Chiodo about their evaluations of Tristan Jarry. This has to be balanced against two different things. One is the goaltending free agent market is just bereft really of opportunity. If you're looking for a true number one, Freddie Anderson is out there, but what are you going to get a year or two out of him maybe? And that's still kind of a crapshoot, to be honest. And other than that, what is there on the free agent market? And then there's the trade market, which is the Winnipeg Jets have given no indications about what they would be willing to take in return for Connor Hellebuck, if that's something they want to do, but that's an expensive deal, both in resources, personnel, and a future contract if you're going to do it. John Gibson might not necessarily be excited at the thought of coming to Pittsburgh, despite the fact that it's home for him, because if things don't go well, scapegoat city, fairly or unfairly. So really, the best possible option, I can't believe I'm going to say this, might be Tristan Jarry on what amounts to a one-year prove-it deal.
Well, let me give you some inside hockey dirt here. There is a change in thinking behind closed doors in much of the league. And I wrote about this a couple or a few weeks ago, that more and more GMs and staffs are talking about going to more of a tandem, a committee, very much like Vegas is doing. I wrote before the deadline, Ron Hextall needed to be calling Vegas about Adin Hill because at the time he was like their third goalie. I've kind of been a little bit of a fan of Adin Hill, and I told people in Vegas when I got here, why isn't this guy starting? But they had, Laurent Brossoit, who was also a third and fourth goalie,
right,
in the Winnipeg system. So they just grabbed 5 goalies and said, okay, whoever's healthy, whoever's playing, you get an NHL sweater for a while. There is this change in thinking where, Carolina did it with Ranta and Anderson and Vegas and, to a lesser extent, Seattle. They had Grubauer, of course, but they supplemented plenty of games around Grubauer, as I recall. So I think the thinking is evolving to, unless you have an elite number one goalie, we're talking Shesterkin, Vasilevsky, or you can get a number one guy on a bit of a bargain deal. Removing those two things, you want to go for a tandem. So you've got depth and you've got insurance, and you probably save a few bucks that way. So I actually think Tristan Jarry will find himself getting a lot of tandem offers. I don't think Jarry's going to get the $7 million,
right?
The $6 million that we thought maybe 2 months ago, because of this change in thinking, because of the Golden Knights, Adin Hill, Brossoit, Logan Thompson, and who the hell else am I forgetting out there? Because
there's like 6 other guys. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, they're number one guys over in Sweden who may never come back. Yeah, Robin Lehner. So we'll see.
So that being said, it's a great point you make about tandems becoming the thing. Kyle Dubas had built himself a little bit of a tandem.
Another one,
in Toronto, and another guy who just sort of accumulated goaltenders, right? Joseph Woll, Matt Murray, obviously, Ilya Samsonov. And so if that's what he's looking at doing here, how then does Tristan Jarry figure into it if he is around for another year? Again, let's say it's a 1-year prove-it deal, but it's not as a number one starter. It's as maybe 1A to a 1B supplement. Well, first step in that is we've got to be able to count on you for the 55 games that we actually want you to start. we can't have you disappearing for 2 or 3 weeks because of an injury. And then our 1B has to be more than just a 1B, or we can't rely on the rotation that we've built in our heads before we go out on a 10-day road trip out west or whatever it may be. Does it make sense to keep Casey DeSmith around as that 1B? Do you move DeSmith and maybe look at the free agent market? There's a lot of different directions to go here, but maybe Dubas has laid a little bit of a blueprint for what he'd like to do based on what he did in Toronto the last year and a
half. Casey DeSmith, I mean, sometimes familiarity, especially on the fans' part, does breed contempt. Mm-hmm. And when you look at DeSmith's salary compared to his standing in the game or, his position, he's quite a bargain. I mean, Vegas had to sign this troop of goalies to about $2 million contracts. So to have a legit backup goalie who can play your 30, 35 games a year for, 1.7, 1.8 that DeSmith makes, you've got a guy. I think if they do go that route with Jarry, you need a third option in there too. I mean, look, his back, his knees, his hip, whatever, all of the above, whatever it was last year that bedeviled Jarry, that he couldn't get healthy, right? I mean, think back to, I think it was November, Chris, when Jarry said, well, I'm dealing with some injuries. It's tough. And so we asked Mike Sullivan, oh, Jarry's injured. He's like, no, he's not.
Yeah.
So.
And then 5 weeks later, whether Mike Sullivan likes it or not, he actually is injured in Boston. So, and there you go. Yeah. The story of the season is written then.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all of those things really come into play. And I'm curious to see what Dubas's analytics mind and the department kind of comes up with for this situation, because you're not going to pay Tristan Jarry a $636 contract. I mean, that would be foolhardy to, I think, level 10 at this point with everything.
Yeah.
So, I'm stumped a little bit to answer your question, other than I think maybe you wrap your arms around several goalies and see what happens.
So the way Dubas, or one of the first things Dubas said to start this press conference, and we'll kind of dismount on this note, was you can bet against Mike Sullivan or Sidney Crosby or Malkin and Letang if you want to, but I'm not going to. What you're in Las Vegas, Dan? I got to ask, what's the safe bet? Is the safe bet that Kyle Dubas helps lead this thing via Mike Sullivan and the Big Three back to one more deep run, if not a cup, if not a parade down the Boulevard of the Allies one more time, at the very least, a deep run to a conference championship and a trip to the Stanley Cup Final? Is that the safe bet, or is the safe bet that Kyle Dubas comes in here, does everything he can to his fullest, his damnedest, to try and accomplish that, but quite simply, Father Time is undefeated, and he can't accomplish 2 goals at the same time and trying to get back to that point while still replenishing an entire organization?
I guess the negative is always the safe bet, right? It's always easier to say, no, it can't happen, and then be surprised when it does. I thought last year, the 22 playoffs was really their chance.
Yeah.
I mean, the way they dominated the Rangers, and just, a cavalcade and avalanche of bad luck sort of unseated them. And there's some pieces missing, and what happens this summer will really determine. I mean, you go for it, right? Listen, this is maybe pie in the sky optimism on my part. I have to think, if Dubas can, in fact, find depth speed, if nothing else, get a third line that can forecheck the daylights out of Washington, the Rangers, the Islanders, even the Devils. If you can flip the script and get on the forecheck rather than chasing the puck, which they did for the entire second half last year because of, I think a poor bottom six. If you can flip that script a little bit, get Sidney Crosby back in the offensive zone, handing the puck off to Evgeny Malkin on the attack. With the talent, the wingers they have, suddenly they become a good team. Mm-hmm. Presumably, someone who can stop the puck too. Yeah, I don't think a Stanley Cup is really possible. I don't see them beating like the Vegas Golden Knights this year, or even the Carolina Hurricanes in a conference final. But I do see them being able to beat everybody else in the Metro Division. So from there, I guess that would be a successful run, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you told me that Crosby, Malkin, and Letang, after the way things went this year, were able to get to the conference finals the following year, I'd consider that a success, and would also lead us to believe that maybe the groundwork is laid to make one more, like I said, one more good run before the three of them all decide to perhaps walk out the door together whenever that may be, knowing that Crosby may be a Tom Brady of sorts and try to play till he's 45, and Chris Letang will be in better shape than I am right now for the rest of his life, and that Evgeny Malkin still wants to have one more dance with that cup as well. It's going to be something to watch over the next 4 to 6 weeks or so and throughout the summer. Dan, thanks for taking some time while you're out there. Real quick, Stanley Cup Final prediction since it gets started soon.
Boy, I've been going back and forth on this. Florida has surprised me at every level. I thought Carolina would just knock them off the map with that man-to-man defense and how good Carolina has been. And for Florida to take them out like they did, I mean, that gives me pause. Doesn't it? You like, wow,
Yeah.
These guys actually might be pretty good. I think this 10, 12-day layoff is going to cool Bobrovsky.
Yeah.
If that happens, Florida can't hang with Vegas. But if Bobrovsky comes into the Cup Final and plays as brilliantly as he's played, you're going to have a 7-game slobber knocker. And I have actually made a couple $100 here in Vegas. I've stayed out of the casinos mostly, but I've bet on the Golden Knights in each of the game 6 they've won to win and the over, because they were the underdogs in both game 6s.
Right.
So I put my $20 to good work.
There you go.
I would probably do the same thing again if the Golden Knights get a chance to clinch. I see Florida kind of buckling. I don't think Florida has that has the heart of a lion. I think they're good, and I think Bobrovsky has gotten him here. But now you need something special to win it.
Yeah, I see it in there, especially with Matthew Tkachuk. But I question if, like you said, that much time off for a goaltender who's hot is never good. So I can't foresee it being a good thing for Sergei Bobrovsky as well. And one thing I always bet on is that playoff Bob is going to show up eventually. And playoff Bob can be an absolute disaster at times. And you'd hate to think it would happen in the Stanley Cup Final, but after a week and a half of, light morning skates and not really having much to do, heading out to Vegas against a team that's pretty hot and pretty buttoned up. Yeah, I could see that being trouble for the Florida Panthers. If positive playoff Bob, the guy who's showed up for the last 5-6 weeks, shows up, then I do think Florida could surprise everybody and shock the world. But I don't bet on playoff Bob. No. A playoff Tkachuk I'll bet on. A playoff Bob, not so much.
Well, here's the problem with playoff Tkachuk is he's going to have to get through 6 feet 3 and 220 pounds of Vegas defensemen.
The Redwoods, like you talked about, yeah.
Yeah, because they have gargoyles at each post. And he's going to have to get through one or both of those guys who are going to just dump him on his head and laugh as they do it. So it's going to be a fun battle to watch, but he's not going to be nearly as effective, I don't think.
Well, Dan, thanks so much again for the time. I really do appreciate you celebrating Dubas Day with us. A Dubas to you and a Dubas to you all.
Is there a Dubas Day poll that we should celebrate with?
No. Well, what I did earlier was I just jumped into the pool with all my clothes on. So that I think should be, it's summertime, right? It's warm pretty much everywhere in the country. So wherever you are as a Penguins fan, I don't care if it's a municipal pool and you got to jump the fence, send the citation to me. No, send it to Dan. He's in Las Vegas. He's got the money. Send it to one of us and jump in a pool somewhere today with all your clothes on to celebrate Dubas Day. In all seriousness, thanks for all the great reporting, for all the insight. Enjoy the Stanley Cup Final, and we'll catch up again soon.
All right. Have fun, Chris.
Great stuff from out in the desert on the Stanley Cup Final from Dan Kingerski. And, of course, on the entire Dubas Watch saga that has now come to, I wouldn't even say a conclusion. I mean, I guess Dubas Watch has reached its conclusion, right? But as we celebrate Dubas Day, now what? That was just the first chapter, right? That was like the prologue. And now chapter 1 starts. How does Kyle Dubas attempt to rebuild the Pittsburgh Penguins while also competing for a Stanley Cup under Mike Sullivan with Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and Chris Letang at the core? God bless him. He's going to do a better job than Ron Hextall. I can almost guarantee that flat out. But God bless him for taking on this task, because it's not going to be an easy one. And it's starting now as you're listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube. He's got to immediately identify what's the plan going forward in goal, and then out from there. The young defensive pieces we talked about, highlighted by POJ, and then out from there to the depth forwards. Can you get faster and younger and also better in those spots? And then to the top six. Does he look to supplement that top six with something that he might not already have, something younger and faster and just as skilled as Crosby, Gensel, Malkin, Raquel, Rust, etc.? Or does one of those guys have to get moved in order to bring in the young speed, the young heavy speed that Dan Kingerski talked about there? A lot's going to happen in the next few weeks and months. We will be here to keep you abreast of the situation. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet. If you're watching this on YouTube, click on the little bell, the notification bell there. And as soon as new videos from 93.7 The Fan are available to you, including full episodes of Fifth Avenue Faceoff, you'll get notified. And of course, wherever you get your podcasts, I don't care where you get them: iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, wherever it is. Be sure to subscribe to Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Hopefully you're getting it inside your Odyssey app, AUDACY, so that you get notified as soon as you tap that little button up in the upper right-hand corner that says follow. You'll get notified as soon as new episodes are available, just like you were for this one. And keep it locked right here all summer as we see where Dubas Day goes from here. It's a new era. It's Dubas time in Pittsburgh and right here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff.